goodness.
Okay, can you do the intro, please? Can you be intro girl? Can you
I
do
can
that?
be intro girly. I can be intro girly.
Because I don't know
Gladly.
why my brain refuses to memorize
It's
it.
like, this is one thing I am not memorizing. I
Yeah,
love this. Okay. Yeah, no, I got
you do
this.
it.
You
And you're
ready?
so good at it.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's do this.
Yeah, wait, yeah.
Look at us practicing good vocal hygiene.
I'm trying.
All right, let's do this. Welcome to Tell Me About It, a podcast by SLPs for everybody. My name is Francie.
And I'm Maggie.
And she got it.
Nailed my part of the intro.
Oh my goodness. Today, we are in the next stage of our back to school journey through special education. Maggie, take it away. What are we talking about?
So I am very excited for this episode because today is the stats episode. So we are going to be talking about statistics and a lot of vocabulary that you will encounter when reading an evaluation report on your child from your school. So I mentioned this last time. I'm horrible at math. Like and not even just I feel like a lot of women are really down on themselves of like, oh, I'm bad at math, and that's like a whole patriarchal thing that we don't have to get into right now. I'm actually really bad at math.
And not to hop on your bandwagon, and to be I'm also like very bad at math. Like not in a way that is humiliating. I am bad at math.
Well, okay, if you're humiliated by your math skills, it sounds like 2 levels higher in math than I did. Because you took calculus and I ceilinged out at college algebra. So but yeah, I think that like my brain truly like dumped all of its power into language, and then I got like just functional like squeaked out stuff in math. So all of that being said, if I can understand and grasp and like utilize this knowledge and information, then truly anybody can, because my brain is allergic to math and I use this information in my job every single day. So don't be scared by the stats episode. Don't be scared by mathematical nomenclature or vocabulary or anything, because we are going to walk through it together and it's going to be okay.
Absolutely. So before we get started, I feel like it's an important disclaimer. We will be talking a lot about average and typical and normal. And the big disclaimer for this is that we are talking about the mathematical average and the mathematical normal. And this will lead us into talking about a bell curve, but this is a range. Normal is not one picture, it is a range here. So we are not, we got a wide variety of what normal might look like, but
Yes.
wanted to start that by just warning you guys that we will be using those terms sometimes and being very clear about what we're talking about when we're saying those words.
Yeah, 100%. We're not using it as like a qualitative adjective where we're describing like the flavor of something of like, oh, that was normal, or like, oh, versus that person's weird. Like we're not using it as like that type of descriptor. We're really using it to talk about numbers. And this comes up a lot in evaluations because a lot of tests are compared to a norm or compared to an average. And so that is what we mean when we say normal, average, or typical during this podcast episode.
So with that leads us into talking about what is the range of normal. And this is where we begin to talk about the bell curve, which I believe is one of Maggie's favorite things.
I love the standard bell curve because it makes so much sense in my brain. And it's also like something that occurs in nature and natural processes. So we will include a visual in the show notes of the standard bell curve, because this is like a graph type thing. It's like a visual. But if you're watching this on YouTube, it is truly like, it's called a bell curve because it looks like if like a Christmas bell was placed on a table. And so it's basically like a giant hill, or like
Think about how
it,
a child would draw a hill, right? It is
yeah,
like you would have
skinny
the
on the side.
ground and then the hill and then the ground coming again.
Yeah.
Yeah, tails on each side, sometimes referred to as tails on each side, and a
Hmm.
tooth. What is it? You mentioned it earlier before we started recording about how much percentage, like
It's
68%
about
of the
2/3. It's 68%. Yeah.
with being that like normal part of that hill.
Yeah. Yes. So as we're talking about the bell curve, picture in your head a hill, if that makes sense, like an anthill maybe would be a good visual for it. Or yeah, like a bell on a table with two skinny ends off to the side and then a big hill shape in the middle. um, and for like statistical applications, this shape represents where the population falls on any given skill, would or like skill or behavior or ranking. Like it's kind of like most people are in the middle. So if you drew two lines, that would be equally divided on either side of the mathematical average. Those two lines would hold within them about 68% of that population that was measured, because most people are average, most people are in the middle. That's where we get those like descriptor terms, right, to describe something that is like conforming to an agreed upon norm. Outside of that range, you would have the kind of like somewhat above or below average. So these would, if you're thinking about athletes, these would be people that maybe played like college sports. So like they are on the high end of average or even above that a little bit. They are like really have dedicated years of practice, have honed their skill and their craft with this sport to be significantly above your average person. Then outside of that are the two very teeny tippy ends of the tails. Using the sports analogy again, these would be Olympic athletes. So these are people that have dedicated their lives to sharpening this skill and are excellent, have like excelled far beyond the average individual. And those go both ways. So if you think about kind of like the inverse version of that on the other side, someone on the low to like the lower end of the average range or outside of the average range on that low end would be someone who's really genuinely terrible at sports, like me, like someone who is like truly.
I say this with love and light. Maggie does fall in that lower than average category with
It's true. I'm very clumsy.
I've seen you get very injured doing
Yes.
very little.
Yes. It's true. And then I don't think I fall into the very tail end there, but that would be like, you know, picture like the clumsiest, most uncoordinated person you can think of. That would be the person that like is the inverse of that. So it kind of spans this range that represents the entire population, either the entire population that a test was developed with, or it can be applied to larger statistical populations, like the whole population of a country or even the world.
Mm-hmm. And Maggie kind of touched on it earlier. You will find bell curves in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, I think about Plinko a lot, or like when you
Mm-hmm.
drop, like with the whole pegboards and they all fall down and are land in the, bottom cups or whatever they are, you will see them make that kind of curved shape with majority
Mm-hmm.
of the little balls or chips falling in the middle and only a few falling at the sides. Races, you'll see the same thing. It's a little bit more of like a rarefaction compression, to use my physics class, my one physics class I took.
Yeah, dang, girl.
Well,
You
you'll
lost
see,
me there with
yeah, right.
rarefaction
Well, you'll
compression.
see just a few at the beginning and a few at the end, and most people being in the middle. And so the bell curve is everywhere. It's all
Yep.
around us, and it's measuring everything that can be measured.
Mm-hmm. And I think that this is something that I love it so much, not because I just love to rank people based on their skills, but like I love it so much because it is almost like equalizing in my mind, where it's like because this can be used to conceptualize a lot of skills. So like before I was saying, I'm terrible at math and sports. So like I would be on the lower end of the bell curve in those two areas, but like I'm really good at other things and I'm squarely in the average range on a lot. And so like, it's one of those things where like, if you think about all of the different skills and all of the different, cognitive areas or whatever it may be that we do throughout our lives, we are all falling on different points of this curve in at different times for different things. And so I think that kind of creates this like mosaic of humanness kind of. I don't know. It's like
it really paints the variety of human. Because one thing that I kind of appreciate of it, because it covers all existence. Like it covers the very, very top to the very bottom of everything. And I think you're right. I think it really highlights the like quiltiness and diversity that exists within our species. Yeah. And it's just, I don't know, it just gives you a lot of perspective.
Yes. And I think just to touch on this really quickly, so we are talking about the standard bell curve. There are other types of bell curves that you will see in different like mathematical or scientific endeavors or experiments, and that usually tells you that there is some external factor affecting how this data falls. So you mentioned one earlier about a professor that put all of the exam scores on a bell curve and found that there were two peaks. So there was the one where you would expect most of the students scored within this average range. And then there was the second peak way up high. And that told him that a significant portion of his students were cheating on the test because there should not have been that second bell curve. So you can have a bell curve that looks like that. You can have a skewed bell curve where like if the population you're testing is really, really good or has received extra training or extra support in a skill, you might see the hill of the curve be higher up. Same thing could be true in the opposite, where like if you're testing a population that has, some kind of lack of a certain skill,
how about like never
or
seen
lack
a
of
penguin?
access to, never seen a penguin.
I come back to penguins a lot with this. Like if you like had never seen a penguin, your bell curve would be lower on the end of never seen a penguin, because statistically you probably haven't seen a penguin. Or like if you don't have.
Wait, I think you lost me a little.
I did. No, sorry. Let me back this up. So
yeah, back up.
I'm gonna back up for a second. Take, for example, if you have no idea what a penguin is, and you live in a place that does not have access to zoos, and you just have no exposure to this, if you did a bell curve of just the people at your town who have seen a penguin, that bell curve is going to be further down the line towards people who have not seen a penguin. You'd still probably see a bell curve, but it's on the lower end of that bell curve, or like think about the number line, like a number line.
Yeah.
Your numbers were going to be on the smaller end than the greater end of who have seen penguin, still making that bell curve shape.
Now I'm with you. Now I'm with you. Yes. And the bell curve is just a way to graph and visualize data points. So like if you have a bar chart, I'm thinking about like hearkening back to my math classes that obviously I've tried to block out. You like create your bar chart, you can draw a curve over that. And like, yeah, sometimes you'll see a bell curve. It happens a lot with like big population type things. So you're less likely to see it if you do a test of like who's seen a penguin and you're in a room of biology majors and there's only 10 of them. You're probably not going to get a bell curve from that graph. But like, yeah, you would get it in bigger population studies and that kind of thing. And we are speaking about it because a lot of the tests that we give to children to get a picture of where their how their language has developed and how they're performing in that skill area, these were tested and developed with large populations of children. And so that's how we wind up with this bell curve. Most people being in the middle, the average range, some people being a little bit outside of that, and an even smaller portion being way outside of that, right?
Which, when we talk about just outside of and very outside of, those also come with names called standard deviations, right?
Yes.
So within the main part of our hump, that is, normal. One outside of that would be considered one standard deviation outside of the norm. So those people who are slightly above or slightly below average, with the exceptional with the exceptions to that rule on either side being 2 standard deviations outside of the norm, right? You will hear that word sometimes, standard deviation, a lot when we talk about testing. I can't remember what it is. It's changing in Missouri for what things need to qualify, but for language, it was a lot of like, you'd hear 1.5 standard deviations. A child would have to be 1.5 standard deviations below the mean in order to qualify for service. So that's how it was for a long time. It's changing. I don't know what it is now. But what that means is that we are 1.5 outside of that normal range. So another word that will get thrown around a lot in the stats world.
Yes. Yeah. And standard deviations, this is where I fall off of like, I I don't know anymore how to find this if given a number set. There's a mathematical way to do it, and I don't know because in practice, I just have to understand what this term is referring to, and it is referring to this group basically that has scored a certain distance away from the mathematical average of this group. So when we as clinicians are giving these tests, the test creators have already done all of the math up front to get these standard deviations and standard scores that we can take and interpret because we know what that means in regards to us and in regards to their language skills. That was probably a little bit confusing, but all of that to say, standard deviations can be different based on the overall sample or the overall population. And there's a mathematical way to find them, but
we don't know what that is.
I forgot.
Rephrase,
I know someone told me. I forgot.
In my stats class, we used a software that helped calculate this, and
Yeah.
I don't remember what the stats software was called. Sorry. And to only loosely remember them explaining it, very similar to how Maggie did, which was just saying there's a way to calculate it. Oftentimes it is calculated for you by whatever. It's unimportant to what we're talking about now.
Yeah.
That is the job for a statistician, not a speech therapist.
That's the thing. Frankly, we don't need to know how to find the standard deviation. We just need to know what what information is that number giving us. And same to the listener. Like if you are a parent whose child is going through an IEP evaluation right now, knowing what a standard deviation is and what it means to you is going to be more helpful than knowing how to find it. If you do know how to find it, good for you, because I have long since forgotten. But let's talk about a standard score. So yes, you have to qualify, your student or a student would have to score a certain number of standard deviations below the mean or the mathematical average. The standard score is 1 point on that bell curve. So when we give a test, we are marking the questions. We're getting a lot of raw data, and we wind up at the end with a raw score. Usually it's how many of these did they answer correctly, or how many sounds did they produce correctly, et cetera, et cetera. That we use these extensive tables in the back of these testing manuals to convert that raw score into a standard score, which gives us where that child is performing in relation to others that have also taken this test. So the standard score is really that's kind of like the golden number. That's the one that you want to focus on, because that's going to give you a lot of information about what is going on for that child. It is worth mentioning, though, that as with any of these tests or any of this kind of thing, it is a Francie, I feel like you put this really well. Like you'll say like uh, a standardized test or a standard score is a snapshot. It's not a,
I yeah,
what do you
so
call it?
when we yeah, so that's I do explain this a lot because parents will be like,
Yeah.
I see them do this other times."
Hmm.
When we are doing a standardized test, we are talking about a one specific time in this child's life when they are sitting down with me and taking this test. This is not an overall picture of them. This is a snapshot of the moment in time that we are sitting down and taking this test. And so if that is 11 to 12 on a Thursday and they haven't had lunch yet, their performance is going to be different and standard scores can vary based off of day, mood, um anything. There's other the temperature in the room. Like if the
Hmm.
kid's cold and they're not focused on my test, their scores are going to be different. And so those are all things that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about standard scores because it is literally it's just a picture of one moment in time for this kid,
Hmm.
not how they have existed up until this point.
Yes. And with that, like the tests that we give are good. Like they have been developed usually over the course of years by researchers and scientists who specialize in this type of work. And so um ideally, if we were to give these tests have something called reliability, which like if we were to give this test again to the same kid, would they score would they get a standard score that's really close to what they got before, even if the first time they tested, they were hungry, they hadn't slept well, and it was really cold in the testing room. And then the second time they took the test, they had a full belly and a great night of sleep and a jacket. Like, are those numbers going to be really close to each other, or are they going to be, you know, worlds apart? Because that tells us a lot about how the test was designed, because you don't want to see those two numbers really far apart. You want to see them as close together as possible.
Which leads us to our another term, which is the standard error of measure. Um, when I had this explained to me by my stats professor in college, they said it is impossible to know truly what the genuine, true, mathematically true standard score is because of all the variables we talked about earlier. So that leads us to something called the standard error of measurement. And we can say, and it gives us these ranges in the back of that book that Maggie was talking about. With 90% confidence, we know that the true score will fall between this number and that number. And when we think about this when it comes to testing, sometimes you will need one standard score that is, below a certain amount, and then one that falls within the standard error of measure. So maybe the child's standard score for that test wasn't the number that they were looking for, but the number that you're looking for falls within that range from provided by the standard error. Then that would help to qualify a child for services or what have you. But this is helping us to understand that with 90% accuracy, the number that this child probably is, all things considered, is within this range.
Yes. Um, yeah, and all of these, we're defining these terms because these numbers will all be reported to you as the parent or caregiver of a child going through this process. And a lot of times, like Francie and I have already kind of touched on the fact that we interact with these scores and these numbers all the time. And so sometimes if you're sitting in an eligibility meeting with other professionals who also interact with this stuff all the time, they might just rattle off some numbers or show you a table printed on a piece of paper. And you're like, okay, great. I don't know what a standard error of measure is, you know? And so um, that that number and that range is important to know because it will be included in, or it should be included in the evaluation report. And it also lends itself to like the validity of the test that has been given, because you don't want to test with like a huge standard error of measure. You want those two numbers to be pretty close together. Um, Another number slash term that I think gets thrown out a lot that has a lot of confusion around it is percentile. Um, this is one this is one that will also be generated by giving and scoring one of these tests. And Francie, do you want to say the difference
Yeah.
between a percentage and a percentile?
Percentile.
Yeah.
I think about percentile. When I think about this, I think about my brother because my brother is very tall. And when we were growing up and going to the pediatrician, I always heard them say, "Oh, well, John is in the 95th percentile for height." And I remember, because I was not, being like, "What does that mean?" And the pediatrician said, "Well, it means that John is taller than 95% of the population." And as a girly from the 5th percentile for height, I was like, "You mean I'm only taller than 5% of people?" And she was like, "Yup."
Mhm.
And so percentile talks about your data score in relation to everybody else in that set. And it's not necessarily that John wasn't 95% tall, but he was taller than 95% of people. So it's not your height compared to yourself, it's you compared to the rest of people in whatever age group or cohort or what have you, the data is looking at.
Yes. And I think that that's important. Like you said, he wasn't 95% tall. I think for a lot of academic stuff and a lot of tests, our brains are trained to think of like, well, how many did I get right? So like I got, 15 out of
90% right.
20,
Yeah.
or I got
Mhm.
90% right or whatever. And these numbers, even though they may seem like percentages, are often not. When we're giving these tests and doing evaluations and reporting these scores, very seldom are we talking about a straight up percentage of like what the child got right versus what they got wrong. That would be that raw score, right? We need that, but we need it because it gives us a ton of other information that's actually way more valuable from a diagnostic standpoint or an evaluation standpoint. Go ahead.
Sorry, that I told myself I wouldn't launch into basals and ceilings, and then I almost just launched into basals and ceilings.
I don't think we need to get into that.
I don't either. Just this is as an aside to you. When it comes to like how many are right versus not right, that's test dependent. So there is no
Totally.
set number. This is going to be my abbreviated basals and ceilings. Y'all don't need to know
Okay.
what this is. This is for testers, or people administering the tests. However, from what you need to know about the tests is that there is not a set amount that they can get right or get wrong. That will be determined by age. That will be determined by test to test. Sometimes they have to get 6 wrong in a row to stop the test. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. That is all test dependent and has nothing to do with the child's performance. What stops the test or how many they got right or wrong will not reflect. I don't know what the best way to word this is. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
I do know what you're trying to say. It's not that it won't reflect. It's that if you see a standard score of 75, that doesn't mean that they got 75% of the questions correct.
Mhm.
That is in relation to this big population on the bell curve that we were talking about before. So, and maybe we should have said this up front, because if you've listened this far into the podcast and we're just saying like, going into an eligibility meeting and reading this evaluation report, try and get that percentage correct mentality out of your mind, because that is really not what these tests are about. And frankly, it doesn't give us as clinicians a whole lot to go off of, diagnostic wise.
That's where I was trying to go with this, with the whole like how many you get wrong. That has nothing to do with that is test dependent. That has nothing to do. It's totally separate thing. When we think about, oh, they got 75% wrong. No, totally different. Raw scores are totally different than what you would get like an A or a B or a C on a test. Not the same things.
And I feel like we are kind of stumbling over ourselves trying to describe some of these terms because
it's confusing.
It's confusing, one, and two, it is different test to test sometimes. So like even some of the tests that we are qualified to give, so speech and language tests, they have different like normed samples. They were developed in different ways. They all have different standard errors of measure. They all have some of them have different standard deviations, and like they have different basals and ceilings, which again, we said we're not going to get into, but like, so we are making these general statements. And if you're an SLP listening to this and you're thinking, wait, that's not correct, it's like, it might be correct for some of the tests, but no, it might not be correct for all of them. But in general, here's what you need to know. Yeah, because it's detailed, it's confusing, it's complicated, and that's how I feel about a lot of math. But you know what? It gives us really good information. And that's why I love it. So,
which leads us to talking about like some of these specific tests that will appear. We won't go through and list them by name. Every district has their own tests that are different.
Oh yeah, because one thing that you should know about these tests is that they are expensive. They cost a pretty penny. And I personally know this because I just bought several of them for my private practice. They are pricey. And if there's one thing we know about school districts, it's that money isn't always free flowing and endless. So a lot of districts have the tests that they have. And that can be difficult as a clinician going in if they have, because sometimes the tests are better at pulling for certain skills, than the one that you have on your hands. But the reality is the one you have on your hands is probably perfectly fine and is going to give you a pretty decent picture of the kid's language. So you might as well go for it because that's what you got anyway.
And so with these standardized tests, and that's I feel like I hear this word thrown around a lot, specifically talking about college when it comes to like taking the ACT, because that is a standardized test, or like the MAP test for Missouri is a standardized test. When we say standardized, great question. What does that mean? Do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So standardized basically means, and actually I'm gonna be transparent, pull up my notes right now, because it can mean two things. It can be a norm referenced test, which I kind of have, I feel like my brain grasps that a little bit more. That norm that we're referring to is that standard bell curve. So it is developed using a large population of people. And in that population that it was developed on, just like we see, in nature for some of this stuff, like people in like the Tour de France that are riding, like you see that kind of bell curve shape in people riding bikes all together in a group. Some people are going to be really, really, really excellent at the language skills that are tested. Most people are going to be fine. They do okay. They got it. They're not perfect, but it's good. And then some people are going to be deficient or have deficiencies in the skills that are tested for. And so the test, when you give it to an individual and score it, they are looking at how that individual performed when compared to that normative sample. So that large population that it was tested on before. And these are also, they control for, or they don't, it's not appropriate to say like they control for this, but these are like, the scores are sectioned out based on age. For really little kids, it can be as many as like a couple of months. Puts you in one age range versus a different one. And some of them also separate out based on biological sex. And so because, we have some research to support that the sexes perform differently or develop a little bit differently, some aspects of communication. So those are all to compare the individual being tested to the people from that population that were most like them. So we're not comparing a 5-year-old's language skills to that of an 8-year-old. We're comparing them to other 5-year-olds.
The other, the other big standardized test that you might see in this testing packet that you give is something called a criterion referenced test. And so instead of comparing the student you're testing to the group of people with whom the test was tested on, you are comparing that student to where they are at in a list of criteria, or like think of it like a checklist of like skills. Where are they at in all of these skills? And you're comparing the student to themselves when it comes to the skills that they have and don't have. Both tests tell us different things. Both tests give us important information. And I know when I was going through grad school, we had professors who would say it's best to do both types of testing. But once again, that's a luxury, depends on what districts have what tests. But it helps to get a better picture, to get both a number that is comparing the student to a group of people with whom are of the same age and this test has also been given to, and also the student compared to themselves and the skills that they may or may not have. Both just make up this big picture of, once again, this snapshot in time. We are only talking about one specific moment during testing or one specific year of their life. If we're talking about a criterion reference, we're only looking at all of the time that they've led up to now in their age. And so it's this big, hairy, complex thing to say we are just taking a little picture.
Yes. Yeah. I think that it is also worth talking about when standardized testing is not appropriate. In my opinion, standardized testing is appropriate for most kids. Like, you are going to be able to give most kids a standardized test, get a reliable score from them, and get a lot of information about how their language is developing, what they are able to do at this point in time, and where we can give you some ideas about where we can go from here skill-wise. But there is a significant portion of the disabled population for which standardized testing is not appropriate. And this is because those individuals are developing totally differently. So
or even in my experience too, standardized testing would not be appropriate for people who have access differences. So many of these tests rely on visual skills, auditory skills, and motor skills. You have to be able to point, you have to be able to see the materials. And so if we have some barriers to access, it is hard to adapt tests to be standardized and continue that standardization when comparing it to the rest of the people, while also considering physical access needs. So I oftentimes don't think that standardized tests are the best for some of my kids who have complex bodies, because I don't think that gives us the whole picture of them. And that's when I would probably use something that's a little bit more dynamic. Sometimes in the SLP world, you'll hear dynamic assessments, which is a lot of observational data. And so there are times, like Maggie said, where it's appropriate. Another example of a time where it wouldn't be appropriate is if we have multiple languages at play, and the test has only been tested against English speakers. I just had a friend text me about this, who works in a related field, being like, hey, this family wants services in this language, but why can't they test them? Well, the test that they want to give them was only tested on people who spoke English. And so sometimes those tests are transferable into other languages. Other times it's not an easy comparison, if that makes sense. Like, it would be like an apples and oranges situation. They're both languages, but we're measuring different things in those languages.
Totally.
And sometimes, kind of off of that point, sometimes dialects are left out of standardized testing.
Girl, everything that you're saying, I was like, oh, let's touch on this really quick. And then you just sat there and rattled off 5 or 6 excellent points. And I was like, I'm so glad we started talking about this, because you are so right.
No, standardized. I know Maggie loves a standardized test. I also love a standardized test for the right profile of children. And sometimes that's not everybody. If you speak a dialect of English other than standard American English, some of these standardized tests will actually pop for saying maybe you have a disorder, and you're not disordered. You just have a dialectal difference. And that's just because the test itself was tested on this specific dialect of English. And so those are all things that we have to consider as practitioners. And it's our responsibility to think of those things when we're looking at the kid that we're testing. What test is going to be the most appropriate to get us the best picture? Is that going to be dynamic assessment? Is that going to be criterion, or is that going to be norm referenced? And they all do different things, and they're all make up this beautiful picture. So
yes,
there you go.
100%. Absolutely. And yeah, I think that just as an aside, more or less, in like the SLP sphere online, I have sensed a push or a movement away from standardized testing. And I think that is absolutely appropriate. sometimes. So like I said before, and I stand by this, like for most kids, standardized testing is going to be appropriate. It's for our high support needs children, our children with complex bodies, our kids with like different dialectical or language influences, our kids with even sometimes really limited exposure to a lot of vocabulary or concepts that can sometimes skew data results, just because it's not that they can't learn this vocabulary or concept, it's that they haven't yet, and that is abnormal compared to the peers that the sample was normed on. It's also worth mentioning that a lot of these tests were developed decades ago and have been updated. Like, it's not like we're using a test from the 90s, like they've been updated since. They put out different versions, but it takes a really long time to edit and test and norm reference these standardized evaluations. It takes a lot of money to do that. And so it's not like there's a new edition coming out every year. So sometimes...
And also, from that too, it also doesn't mean that people are going to buy the new version of your test. And so going back to the limiting factor that is financials, if you have a 4th edition of the assessment and they just came out with a 5th, but the 5th edition is now $4,000, you're going to rock it with the 4th for a little bit, which is all, once again, things that we have to consider when administering tests.
And it can come up in really small ways. Like one of the really popular language tests for kids has a newspaper as a test item. And most kids today have no idea what that is. They just don't know what a newspaper is, like, because we don't interact with newspapers anymore. And so I do remember one time I was giving that exam to a kid, and the stimulus was a picture of a newspaper. And I asked them what this is, like to name it. And they said fire truck, because the picture on the newspaper was of a fire truck. And I was like, I mean, yeah, kid, like if you don't know what a newspaper is, fire truck is a great guess. And it's not because they are unable, like that wasn't a semantic vocab error. It was, they didn't know what a newspaper was, so they gave me the next best thing. I do think that so like missing one, like we said before, get that like percentage correct out of your head. Missing one question on a test is usually not going to make or break your overall score. So like, that's why sometimes what that standard error of measure is there for. That's what all of the other questions in the test are there for, right? So it doesn't skew the data a whole lot, but it skews it a little. And it is worth talking about and worth thinking about too.
Testing is, I feel like, necessary for a lot of situations. It's also very confusing. And it's also only one part of your child.
Yep.
And so I'm really fascinated by it in a lot of ways. Once again, from that whole like human experience side of things.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's just so much to consider and think about. And then I think the parting knowledge that I want to give to you is that this is not a judgment of your child.
So true.
This is not a moral judgment of your child of whether they are good or bad or anything. This is truly data in its most human form, but there can be a lot of emotions that come with this. I think that's going to be a big trend that you hear at the end of these episodes that we talk about back to school, because it's hard not to separate the feelings of the feelings you have about your own child from the numbers that we give you. But this is not us saying, this is not us making a moral judgment in any direction of your child based off of the scores that we receive from this test. And if your scores indicate that your child would benefit from help, we want to give you that help.
Totally. Yeah, I think that we as a culture assign a lot of morality to academic achievement and just straight up intelligence and intellect. And that can sometimes have the effect of, if we're sitting in an eligibility meeting with a family and we're saying, your child scored below or significantly below the mean on these 5 tests that we gave, that can come across as really hurtful. But ultimately, like, just to echo what you said, it's not a morality thing. It's not about the value of your child. It's not about the value that your child brings to this school or to their class or to your family. It doesn't say anything about you as a parent. It just says, this is a picture of their skills at this time. Where do we go from here to get them the support they need to be successful in this specific area? And yeah, since we're talking about school evaluations, that specific area would be school. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I see a lot too of like a narrative online with parents who have children who have diagnoses that will last them a lifetime, more than just like a learning disability, but things like Down syndrome or autism, where these tests can be really devastating for them.
Yeah.
And so I want to make sure that we acknowledge, like, we're sorry.
Yeah.
We're sorry. This is sometimes the really painful part about getting your child access, is highlighting where they're at. But we want to also say, therapists see, at least I know these 2 therapists, see all of the other good things about your kid, how fun they are to work with, how how resilient they are. And so, yeah, don't let the numbers get you down, because your
Yeah.
kid is still a kid. Your kid is still a person, who
Mhm.
has factors that we cannot test on these things. So yeah.
Yeah. And we also feel the irony a lot of the time of, especially kids with those like kind of lifelong diagnoses where it's like if we have a student on our caseload with Down syndrome and his 3-year reeval comes up and we are required by the school to give a standardized test to prove that he still is disabled under the eyes of the state and needs services, we're like, all right, sure. Like, it's like, we know he still needs support. We know we're going to give the support, but we kind of have to like cross our T's and dot our I's on the paperwork side of things. And sometimes you do get some new information. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're like, yep, that's exactly how I thought it was going to go.
Oh my goodness. So
Yeah.
that was kind of a brief overview into the words that you will hear when you sit down at a table, after your child has gone through a couple weeks of testing, and this strange lady hands you a packet, and it's a novel.
A thick, thick
It
stack
is
of
a
papers.
thick stack
Yeah.
of papers, and they're gonna hurl some numbers at you. So this is kind of the pocket version of what do these numbers mean when they hand you this novel of numbers and summaries.
Yep. And just like, yeah, statistical and educational jargon. Like, what does that mean? Hopefully, this is a little, can be a little like pocket guide to how to read the evaluation report, how to make sense of those tables and graphs. But yeah, at the end of the day, like, I think that you really hit the nail on the head, Francie. Like, your kid is not a series of numbers and graphs. Your kid is a person and has traits and qualities that we cannot quantify. And that is true of every child. But I want it to especially ring true to parents who are sitting there. Sometimes it feels like you're sitting at a table and listening to a list of things that your kid is bad at. And that absolutely has to hurt. So yeah, it's hopefully this at least takes the edge off of not knowing what a lot of these words mean.
Oh my goodness. I don't know how we want to wrap this up.
I
So,
know. Well, we are still kind of in our series about school. And next episode, we are going to talk specifically about the eligibility meeting itself. So today we talked a lot about the things that you will hear and find during the eligibility meeting. But next time, we're going to talk about what is the purpose of that meeting, and what are some of the eligibility categories that you might hear when discussing your student in special education in Missouri. So next week is going to be another like very Missouri specific episode because like we said last time, these laws
right.
and categories vary state to state. So we can really only talk about how it is in Missouri because that's where we live and work.
Shout out to Missouri. Thank you so much for joining us on this day. Sometimes the numbers, I don't like, I think we finished the last episode very similar where we said like, sorry for being a bummer. But sometimes this is not always the most fun, but I think it's really important. So thank you for being here on this journey with us and listening along to help, once again, wade through the waters of special education. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, we are at, you can find us at Tell Me About It SLP on Instagram. We are also on YouTube at Tell Me About It and SLP podcast. And finally, and for real, we are on Spotify. Finally checked that one off the to-do list. So we are on Spotify. Also, you can find us under Tell Me About It and SLP podcast. But yeah, thanks for listening and we'll see you next time. Bye.